so that our corn is palatable. Again, niacin is released and we're able to eat it without any repercussions, right? Because if you eat too much of it, it can cause peligro if it's not nixtamalized. Now, I think what's beautiful about understanding the life and the history of the tamal is that it was base of culture. It was the base of everyday interactions. It basically instructed, provided those instructions on how to move in the world, how to exist in the world. Because in Mesoamerican society, corn, specifically the tamal, was right. The teacher was the center, was what was in the table. And what I had shared also with NYT is the understanding how it came from something that was prestige and spoke to the food of the gods and the food of the land, and it was respected, how that affiliation got taken away, right, as a result of colonization. The colonizers arrived with their ideologies and basically took that away, began to look at our corn-based food, began to look at the tamal as an inferior food. And so it changed the dynamic of how people interacted with the tamal, how people wanted to eat the tamal. No longer was the fillings of the tamal the original things, right? Our ancestral foods. We began to implement and use the colonizer ingredients like corn, like what is it? Beef, chicken, pork. Those were foods that came with colonization. Those were the foods that the colonizer craved and believed strongly that if they were to eat any other foods that were indigenous, that they would lose their power. They would lose their this idea of superiority. And so we see that shift in the tamal and in the life cycle, because as a result of that, folks began to become embarrassed to eat the tamal, and it became considered low grade food. And so what I shared with NYT was that the tamal by far is not a low grade food. This is something that has been, in existence for a very, very long time. It is very diverse. It is full of flavors. It's very earth based. And then also with the tamal, and going back to these ideas of the recipes that come with it, right? I personally don't see the tamal as an object per se. For me, it is very alive. It is very much wound in knowing, because when you look at the tamal and you break it down and you understand the complexities of it and its histories and how it has resisted and survived ecocide and the attempt to really, obliterate it from existence, right? It managed to survive. It managed to hide. It managed to thrive. And for me, the work that I've done, I always make the argument, and and I know we're going to talk about this, is that the way it's been able to sustain itself again has been because its code, its recipe has been instructed in our tongues, right? We have these taste cravings, these taste memories, and those taste memories equate to a recipe. And so I always say it was able to strategically maneuver, strategically keep itself alive. And so the tamal per se and the history of corn um, is powerful. It starts with creation. It starts with livelihood. It's been able to keep civilizations alive, right? And not just here in the Americas. I mean, that corn went everywhere. It's everywhere, and it thrives. And so I was able to share on just touch on all these. I'm really touching on all of these different components. And of course, this was a conversation that happened within 8 hours. So I'm trying to minimize it for this time. Um, but again, something that I emphasize over and over again is that the tamal teacher, and it reminds us and teaches us about the importance of culture. It teaches us about how to resist and how to not be defeated.
Yeah, I love that. We also talked about food resiliency, and I think corn is that perfect example, right? That it was
Yeah,
resilient through the times, it was resilient through colonizers, and then when they colonized our taste buds, right? We still always found a way back to it. You also talked about
always.
always, and you also talked about how, certain crops or certain things sort of went away when the colonizers came, but they still found a way to come back. And you talked about how like there was something, I think it was amaranth, right? That's like you can find in the Midwest, but not necessarily everywhere else. Can you sort of dig into that a little bit too?
Yeah. So, I think what's really fascinating, and this is something that really speaks to the creation of borders, right? Because prior to colonization, there was no, the Mexican border. I mean, that's all again an ideology. It was just Native America, like, if we want to use those terms. But in understanding food has always been mobile, just like the memories, right? Because we embody them, we with us wherever we go. And what's interesting is that there was a lot of trade, right? And within those trade routes that existed, um, food and seeds were being transported. And in my work within the Native food movement, I have been really taken back because I've gone out to Minnesota, I've gone out to North Dakota and to South Dakota, and why is there wild amaranth growing, right? I'm like, wait a minute, how did amaranto arrive here? And it's situated in deep central Mexico. And again, right, you find something the earth tells you, so they're like, okay, well, let me research this, let me figure this out. So through reading and dialogue and storytelling and the recipes that have been passed down, you put the whole picture together and you come to realize that as a result of indigenous trade routes, right, um significant to say that there was a lot of culinary exchanges that happened between the northern natives and the southern natives, right? So from the Purepecha, from the Mexica, they were making exchanges over with the Lakotas and the Sioux, right? And so maybe there was exchanges of bison. Well, here's some amaranth, and what do is we spread our seeds.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that, and it takes me back because when we actually look, we begin to see what really is abundant in our pathways,
Right. I
right?
think, yeah.
And yeah.
I think what's really interesting is you sort of take everyone up and out to look at the land, right? And the importance of what land has done for us, right? And the environment and the fact that a lot of these foods through trade routes, but also through centuries, right? They still exist. They're still here for us. And whether it's shared down through recipes or just stories, right? It's all here. One of the things, speaking of land, that you guys both rejected, which I think our team found so interesting, was this idea of a food desert. You guys both had your own ways of sort of rejecting that metaphor. And so I'd love to hear from both of you. Claudia, can you talk about kind of the desert landscape from an indigenous standpoint? And Olympia, I really want to hear about you talking about food deserts versus what you just mentioned, food apartheids. And again, if models like supermarket are part of the solution of a food apartheid.
Sure, sure. Olympia, did you want to go first, or do you want me to go ahead and delve in?
I would love to just say that it was so dope. Like I just really enjoyed listening to everything that you shared, and there's so many things about that were very eye opening. Um, so yeah, I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, you're sweet.
And um, so the distinction that I make in my work when it comes to food deserts is that when someone hears the word desert, they think of something that naturally occurs, right? They think of the Sahara, they think of the Mojave, they think it's something that is, they think it is something that is there because nature wants it there, nature has placed it there. And the situation that we face in this country around food was not placed here by nature, it was placed here by people. And
Mhm.
it was placed here by the desires and the motivations of people. And it sort of is this shift it's this shift of thinking. Many of us are not really in touch with the earth, which I'm sure Claudia is going to speak to. But if we were in touch with the earth, if we had more experiences, even growing one piece of food, we would know how abundant the earth itself is. You plant one tomato seed, just one tomato seed, and it not only gives you maybe 50 tomatoes, maybe more, but it will also have seeds in all of those tomatoes to give you more food. So the earth is already set up to provide us everything that we need. But the situation that we face in the communities I grew up in is food apartheid. There's a separation and there's a tale of two cities. Like you mentioned, where on the west side, you can't drive a mile without running into a grocery store. You have an abundance of stores to pick from. Do I want Erewhon today, or do I want Whole Foods, or do I want Trader Joe's? You have many choices available to you. But when you come to South Central, places in East LA, different pockets of Los Angeles, when you do make it to a grocery store, they're few and far between. When you do make it in there, it's very low quality food. It smells like death in there. The rotten food that was expiring on the west side is being picked up and dropped off in the hood to sell. And so it's creating a situation where, based on where you live, determines your ability to have a healthy life. So that's the distinction I make between the terms. I still do say food desert just because it's something that people recognize, but it's just really important for people to look at this issue as something that people can and need to solve, versus like, oh, like there's just naturally always going to be poor people. There's always going to be hungry people. That's a lie that this Western paradigm has told us.
Yeah,
Hey,
I totally agree with you on that.
I just have a quick note for Olympia. Can you sort of dig in, because the concept of food deserts being man-made, I think for maybe a lot of people it might be new to them. Can you talk about why that happened? I mean, just from your perspective.
Yeah, this could be a potentially lengthy conversation if you want to talk about why food deserts exist, but to just shorten it, one of the ways food deserts came about and there's a video that has been circulating. I think 50 Cent posted it, but there's a book called The Color of Law, and the author of this book is speaking to this subject, and it's basically showing how, I think it's in Leavittville, New York. It was the first suburb, and he wanted to build, I think, 4,000 houses or some crazy amount, 15,000 houses. And where are you going to get a loan for that? Well, he had to get it from the housing administration, but the housing administration said, we will only give you this loan if you put it in the deeds of these houses and you make it a policy that we will not sell these houses to African American people. That's a law that is still in the deeds of most of these houses, even though it's not enforceable. So these houses in today's cost would be like $90,000. Any working class family could afford it. But now these houses are worth like $500,000, et cetera. So that's one example of how generational wealth, what we were blocked from generational wealth. And that's an example of overall redlining. And that kind of redlining is what created situations where Black and Brown communities didn't have the resources they need. Then those are earlier examples. And then once you get to the 70s, you have situations where some of these laws are starting to come down and people are moving into these various areas, especially in LA. I love to get into the history of LA. It's so important for us to remember our history in LA. When we talk about gentrification, et cetera, many people don't understand what their grandparents or their great grandparents went through to even be able to live in certain neighborhoods. Crenshaw, if you're looking at the past of Crenshaw, when you start to understand Culver City used to be a sundown town, et cetera, you really start to understand these are not far away things that, it happened during slavery, blah, blah, blah. This is all recent stuff. And many of the legal mechanisms that were used to enforce these things, they're still in place. And the economic mechanisms are surely in place. So when white flight started to happen and people started moving to the suburbs because they didn't want to live around Black or brown people, they also took the businesses with them. So there's a lot of grocery stores that closed and were never able to reopen, et cetera. The riots happened. There's many stores that closed. This is specific to LA. So there's a lot of reasons and ways that humans have created this situation. I think the most current example of how this situation is being created by the human hand is just our health landscape in this country, period. It's big business for people to get sick. It's big business for people to not have access to fruits and vegetables. We spend $1 billion a day on preventable health care, and we spend even more on subsidies for unhealthy food. And so we're sort of in this hamster wheel or this system that rewards companies for both providing low quality fast food and also makes it possible for the pharmaceutical and the medical establishment to make money off of people when they come down with the conditions that result from those foods. So those are just some ways that this is a man-made situation. And just on a basic level, like, people build grocery stores, right? So humans build groceries, can choose to build grocery stores or to not build grocery stores. Like, these are all people created issues. These are not things that are arriving from nature, but it is arriving from the nature of Western society. So when people act like it's natural, I think it's natural to a certain mindset.
Yeah.
Oh, Olympia, that was so good. Thank you.
I want to actually a little bit to that, Olympia, just because you got me thinking, if that's okay, Hershini.
Yeah, please.
So, I really love that you tapped on to talking about the redlining, and because immediately in my mind went to, right, there's a historical component to this, right? We're talking about the ideologies that created, xenophobia, the ideologies that created environmental racism, right? They're all situated within these concepts of white purity and white superiority, because you don't want to taint your quote unquote your race. And these were the ideologies that have been prominent and dominant for over 500 years, right? With the arrival of the Spanish into Mesoamerica, we see that throughout. I mean, through the casta system, and then again in the history of LA. And it's really unfortunate that there isn't a lot of conversations that really address this, because like you mentioned, this is very recent history. I mean, we're talking within the past 150 years, like, and even less, there's still laws that have not been changed. And again, I think these factors, for us to really explore and understand the root of these problems, and the root as to why, quote unquote, we have these food deserts, right? It's all based off environmental racism. And again, the idea that who is disposable and who is not, right? And again, folks of color are viewed as disposable bodies because we can be replaced, and we're viewed as the workers of society. So again, this is all conceptualized. This is not just a phenomenon that just occurred. Like this, there was intentionality placed around keeping divisive, communities, so that way some can flourish and some cannot. And again, this is all a product of racism at the end of the day.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something you said earlier about them arriving and not wanting to eat the indigenous foods because they would lose their power. And to me, what that translates into is when you eat from the earth and when you're in tune with the earth, when you engage in indigenous cultural practices, you lose your thirst for blood. And so their power is their ability to separate themselves and not be one with the rest of the world. And so I just thought that was like such a good point, and yeah, you're so right.
Yeah, definitely.
This is so fun.
Bring it.
Wait, so Claudia,
Oh, sorry.
no, is
Yes,
there
you wanted me.
yeah, I'd love for you to sort of touch upon what your
Yeah. Exactly. No, thank you. And I think this is a really good like segue, because I was like, wait, I know I had to say something else. So again, right, in thinking about environmental racism, within an indigenous perspective, and the perspectives that I have grown with, and the perspective that I have been reminded through the work that I've done, and this is like groundwork. This is not just all theoretical work, right? Like this is, I consider myself an activist scholar. I'm very present with my community. And in being present with my community, what I have learned is that, right, like we've been taught to see a particular way. We've been taught to be dependent a particular way. And we've also been taught how to prepare our foods a particular way. And if we don't do it this way, that means it's not the right way. And so these concepts around food deserts is a little offensive per se. And the reason for that is because right, it really diminishes and takes away from the land. It these ideas keep us from looking, actually seeing what's happening, right? And like I'm from the East LA area, so when we're talking about like East LA, Boyle Heights, for example, yes, we have these issues where who has access to certain markets, who does not, how many miles you have to drive away to get to, get some organic foods and so forth. And we can talk that political realm and really address it, because it is something that has to be addressed through food policy and so forth. And then too, right, the gerrymandering that occurs within these redlining issues. But at the end of the day, what ultimately is happening is that a lot of communities of color, especially the older generations, and we do have a lot of youth and younger generations as well, right? So there's this bridge that's actually beginning to come together, is food. People are growing food. Like there's no doubt about that, right? We have hundreds of community-based gardens. We have hundreds of folks from their homes, right? Like you walk down East LA, you're going to see tomatoes again growing in somebody's yard. You're going to walk to another house, they're going to have a pot. It might not be, your luxury pot that you have, but it might be a bucket. But guess what? There's going to be chilies growing on there, right? So that's one illusion, is that, oh, well, there's no food accessible. Well, the community makes sure that there's food one way or another, right? There's neighborhoods that have corn growing in their front yard. Right, so that's one particular aspect. Now, the other aspect that I really want to address here is understanding that our landscapes are edible landscapes, particularly here in Los Angeles. We have all kinds of different terrains, from the ocean to the middleland to urban centers up to the mountains. There is abundance of food, and again, these foods have been considered lesser of foods because they are affiliated with indigeneity. And so that's something that, folks consider quote unquote savage or primitive. Yet those are the foods that are healing the land. Those are the foods that are healing our bodies, right? And within indigenous perspectives, there's no separation between the land and our bodies. It's all one and the same. And so, for example, just in urban LA alone, we find the yerba mansa, we have the elderberry, we have the piñon pine, we have the manzanita, the wild cherries, right? We have the yerba santa, we have the agave, we have the white sage. And in fact, even the introduced weeds that we have here that people are like, oh, we need to get rid of them. Stinging nettle, for example. We can make pesto out of that, right? We have the yucca flowers that grow all along the hills. We can make soup. The prickly pears, right? The juniper berries. All of these foods are quote unquote our wild foods, but those are the natural foods of this land. And again, they've been devalued because they don't come from globalization on top. They're not being packaged, they're not being branded. And so when I hear and have these conversations around food desert, I always take myself back, because I look at my front yard, for example, and I say, well, there is food, right? But we've been told that it is not. It's something separate from us. It's something to be afraid of. And again, it's this culture of fear that has been introduced. So that way we don't trust these foods because, oh, they might kill us. Well, that's far from the truth, because these foods are medicine, right? Our food is medicine. The food that's going to kill us is these highly processed, highly packaged, highly, broken down, these commodities that have been recreated, foods that are not even natural. Right, it's this whole shift. And for me, as a Purepecha Huasteca Chicana woman living in LA, I have learned to see again, right? And this took as this became a process of remembering. This able to reevaluate and really appreciate my landscape was a result of, again, like you mentioned earlier, my grandmother's recipes. Because you're thinking about, well, what ingredients were used here, or how am I going to make this cedar tea, or how am I going to make this piñon tea? Well, I need a piñon, I need pine needles, I need, cedar branches, and again, just working out of the land. It's almost like if the land said to me, hey girl, like, what's up? I'm glad you're here. Welcome. And one of the elder chefs that I work with, and these are all indigenous chefs. I don't play with colonizer chefs at all. They reminded me and they said, Claudia, it's really important for you to understand that it was the food that called you. It's the food that chose you. And that's when I really came to understand a little bit better that that food is alive and the land is alive. These plants are alive, right? They can communicate, maybe not in the way we, talk, but they have different methods. And so, it is going to take it's going to take that work, but it's the work that's necessary if we want to reclaim our communities, right? And back to that talk around community, because you can't have community without food and culture.
Mhm.
And again, you can't have food and culture without community. So if we're really talking about decolonizing and claiming and remembering and revitalizing and renewing, then we have to begin to redirect how we see and pay attention to what is growing on the land. And again, right, this idea of grasses, like, what is that, right? Like, these were concepts that were introduced with developers to create this white aesthetic. And again, I'm like, oh, no, I'm going to pull my grass out. And that's exactly what I did, right? And I start to, work my land so that my land knows I appreciate you. And I'm going to plant sage, and I'm going to plant what you already know, because I know that these seeds are going to respond, because they're going to say, oh, I'm in a safe place. This is my landscape. And just like this is their landscape, this is also mine. And right. So it's a lot of, shifting and decolonizing the mind,
Mhm.
especially when we're thinking about food
Claudia,
and food deserts.
what are some resources? Because even for me, I want to dig into this because everything you're saying is so right. And the idea, right? Not even the idea, the fact that land is, I mean, there are things that are very familiar to land, particularly in Los Angeles. How do we learn more? Like, are there books? Are there classes, videos? I mean, I know you teach, obviously.
Yeah, that we do have a couple of master foragers here in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
and unfortunately, they're not of native descent.
Mm.
At least not here in the Tongva LA area. And there's critiques around that, because it's like, well, how do they get to be the masters? Who gave them the authority, right? Who gave them permission? Um, and I know that the kind of lessons and the workshops they do, they're making effort. However, it's still situated with it's just another white space.
Mhm.
So if we're looking to get away from those white dominant spaces, because with that comes white ideology, within that comes white supremacy, within that, even if there's good intentions, right, it's again, like you said, well, who's doing the work?
Mhm.
And so when we're talking about what are the resources, right, it's there's a lot. It depends what kind of work we want to do. Do we want to get into the gardens, right? Do we want to get into just at least understanding these concepts, like beginning to reevaluate these concepts, or understanding, for example, Mesoamerican history? And I guess that's a place I like to kind of redirect people, is to rethinking our histories.
Mhm.
I could make a few suggestions as to like what resources are out there. One thing that is out there, and this came from the Chia Seed project, is called it's right here. It's the ethnobotany project. This is actually by a few elders that developed, rethinking Tongva LA, providing those kind of resources that are available to us. There's also, and this is by the Chia Seed Collective. This is another one, which is Cooking the Native Way. And this is through the Chia Seed Collective. And again, this is all just from within LA. There's another resource that came out, which is called the Kumeyaay. And Kumeyaay, it's called, ethnobotany. And that's another area that I would suggest for people to rethink if they want to rethink the land. So if you want to rethink the land, then you want to look at ethnobotany or indigenous ethnobotany, right? So there's another one that came out, which is the Kumeyaay. And this is one of those books that addresses that. And then there's recipe books like the Sous Chef. That particular book it's all about recipes that use only indigenous ingredients, right? So there's no colonizer ingredients in there. And so really we're working on our palate. But now if we're really thinking about like this ideologically, then I do recommend some other books that I do have. One of them is Remembering Our Grandmother's Gardens.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's one that's like the most profound ever. It's called The Body of the Conquistador. And that particular book really addresses food and race. So again, it takes us back to understanding the ideas around white supremacy and upholding the white body, protecting the white body from not eating and tainting it. And then there's also Jeffrey Pilcher's book, which is Que Viva la Tamal. And that one really focuses on the transformation of food, but it looks at the politics that were involved. It looks at the colonial models that occurred, right? So those instances that brought us where we're at today. In terms of people that are doing this work, like myself, honestly, there's pockets of folks that are doing this work, and you could hear, the folks that are doing, decolonizing the diet work, right? So there's hashtags that folks can follow. One of them would be decolonizing the diet. Another one would be indigenous foodways. And I know for me, I've done a lot of workshops in the community, and I know that it is my responsibility because I love my community, and I want to see people flourish. Now, when it comes to, well, who's doing this kind of work, I mean, there again, it just depends the community. There's different people, but there isn't enough. There isn't a lot of folks that are doing kind of workshops and talks and unpacking and holding space and making space. And so I guess it's part of my calling, which by next year I want to be able to make this more accessible. So I want to begin to offer more workshops, and I might have to do it via Zoom because at this point, like, it's necessary. It really is. But I'd be more than happy to, once I kind of take time to reflect and think about at least some leaders that I'm aware of that are here in LA. And these are, this is like below the grassroots, right? These are below the grassroots leaders, but they're leaders nonetheless that are, speaking to these learning processes, right? Like how we learn, how we can begin to decolonize, our ideologies, and more so decolonize our food.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, the person that takes it deep, like within indigenous perspectives and within, the political, the Chicana politic that I'm situated in, I mean, I'm the only person I know that is addressing it in this manner.
Okay.
As of now, within my generation, within the Los Angeles area.
All right, Claudia, we're gonna look up classes that you teach then. I think you're gonna get a lot of people
Yeah.
asking you how we teach classes. I think for me, the most fun part about this conversation has really been digging into race, right? And sort of like what has been man-made and created in our society, and how the past has really informed where we are now, right? Both of you guys are doing, and not even doing, you're making change, right? And what is happening today based on what the colonizer or the oppressor has done in the past, and how do we sort of like come out of that? Claudia, you already sort of touched upon how food and culture impact community. I don't know if you wanted to add more to that. Olympia, I also want to hear your perspective, and then we'll start to open it up to the group because I think there are a handful of questions.
Cool.
Y'all know we're, I just want to say really quickly, I'm happy to move straight to questions. I wanted to say too that everything that Claudia was saying was reminding me of my trip to New Zealand last year for my birthday. And one thing I was very struck by is how Maori culture there is integrated into the society. When you go to the airport, if it says welcome to New Zealand, it'll say the same thing in Maori. When they do the national anthem, they do the national anthem and then they do the anthem again in Maori. And it doesn't mean that, that I'm sure they still have their share of ignorance and problems and systemic racism, but the indigenous people of the land are honored in all aspects of society. And I would love to see Los Angeles work towards something like that, so that the questions that you're asking, you're getting it when you're coming up in school. Like, I didn't want to, California history, it's like they made us build these missions, like whatever, you know what I mean, when we were in like second grade. And it would have been much more valuable if we were learning about the plants of the land, if we were learning maybe the language aspects of the language, if we were learning aspects of the culture. And I think that would be something great to push towards for the future. I just think that would be really awesome. So thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it so far.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Olympia, on that. And something that just resonated right now too, and Harshini, going back to this question as to what are the resources, there's actually a really good documentary. It's on PBS, and it's focused here on Los Angeles, and it's called Tending the Wild. And it's an hour-long piece, really looks at the landscape and looks at how California has changed, and this idea around environmental protection, and then also to how indigenous communities were taken away from their access to the land, which is basically meaning access to their food. which is a form of destruction of culture. But however, this particular documentary, Tending the Wild, just does a fabulous job in really addressing these issues and the issues like we're talking about here, and then also provides a leeway into what it means to colonize the diet.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to make mention of that. And before we go into talking about food, culture, and community, I also wanted to do a recognition because, back when I began really unpacking and understanding the decoloniality of food in the body, a lot of my influences came from, Black scholars. And one of them was Layla Africa. And I just pulled this book up right now. And this book right here, I went through this book when I was in my 20s and I was like, oh, right. But it's African Holistic Health and just really addresses an understanding again, right, the introduction of food and these ideas of white superiority. And one post here that I really always come back to this picture is really looking at junk food and how it's killing the Black community, and it really addresses like this idea of whitening our food: white sugar, white flour, white rice, white salt, white cow's milk, right? And he ends with, if it's white, don't trust it. And this is within, there's a lot of interreferences here. But again, there's different types of resources out there, and they might not be addressed specifically like, oh, we need to decolonize, or oh, we need to remember. And again, there's a lot of books that speak on that within Native science. But sometimes they're like through looking at through health, but with those radical thinkers, right? That then they provide an avenue to begin to piece this, together. But in answering that question really quickly, I did touch on it in thinking about the intersection of food and culture and community. And again, I'm going to stress it one more time, is that when you have food and culture, you're always going to find community. It's just a given. And when you find community, you're always going to find food and culture. None cannot exist without each other, right? It is a very tight-knit, interconnected relationship. And I think what's beautiful about that is that, again, this really speaks to those indigenous models. And this is everywhere, because it talks about unity. It talks about, collaboration. And also too, it's not exclusive. It's very inclusive of the land. It's very inclusive of, again, seeds, water, earth, all these different dynamics that equate and equal to food. What is food? And, culture is created around food, right? So, when you have culture, it's just impossible. You cannot have culture without food, because food is usually the center of that culture. It's going to define what that culture is. Culture is going to move the way the food does. So if you are, say your culture grows maize, for example, then everything within that movement is going to be to honor the corn. It's going to be a corn-centered culture. And with that comes community. And I want to emphasize too that, community again is not just about the human to human, it's also human to non-human and non-human to human, right? So we're talking about a broader community. We're talking about an ecological community. And that's something that exists within the intersections of the intersections, because it's all there. And this all basically comes back to how we view and how we see, and how we no longer perpetuate these ideas that we're better than the plant, or we're better than the food I'm about to prepare. No, we're not. We're one and the same. And so I just wanted to just add that little component to that part of thinking about food, culture, and community.
That's beautiful to think about us in this at the same sort of level, at the same sort of cadence or caliber, right, as food, because I don't know that anyone thinks about it that way. So that's a really interesting way as we think about what we're preparing, what we're putting into our bodies, how we're nourishing. That's really interesting. There's a question actually that's very, I think, appropriate for what you just spoke about. And this is for both of you, but the question is around culture, right? So how is new culture being created because of new recipes, new types of food, whether it's colonized or not, or whether it's pre-Columbian or current?
Mm-hmm. I see it all the time, and I personally love it. We're talking about fusion food, we're talking about hybrid food, and you know, one thing that's important to understand is that culture and tradition is forever changing,
Mhm.
right? It might be food centered, but what I've seen, for example, with when I'm working with the native chefs and we're doing these native pop-ups, we bring in the dandelion, we bring in the stinging nettle, and those were introduced weeds, right? But yet, like I was taught by one of my chef elders, he said, you know, Claudia, we are giving this food new purpose. Because in Western society, they're going to pull this out and consider it a weed. We are indigenizing this food. And I was like, how so? He's like, well, we are using it, right? We're not, it has a purpose. We're giving it a purpose. And so what I see is that there's a different type of appreciation for, some of those wild foods that are introduced foods that came with, white settler colonialism. Um, and yet, right, it's becoming, we are inviting it because, right, it's still a nutritious source. It still wants to feed us.
Mhm.
Not it wouldn't exist,
Mhm.
right? It wants to make itself accessible. And so, we integrate it, and when we're integrating it, then we're developing new recipes, right? So we're going off of some old traditional recipes, but we're thinking, what if we add a little bit of, stinging nettle, for example? What is this going to do for our food? And in doing so, then we learn to have a new relationship, right, with this particular plant, where before we had no relationship with that plant. And so, that's how I'm seeing this evolve. This is how I'm seeing change. And I'm also seeing how it's changing some of the flavors. And it's not taking away, but it's enhancing. And I think that's what's beautiful, is that there is a recognition, like, okay, this might not be an indigenous based food, or this was, this particular weed wiped out all kinds of native plants, but it's not its fault, right? And we're not going to hate on it. We're not going to pull it out. We're going to use it. We're going to utilize it. And so then it engages our body to respond to it differently. We have to learn how to harvest it. We need to learn how to respect it. And so, it enhances and teaches us how to respect the plant, which, you know, um, that's not something that's always situated within culinary circles, right? Culinary circles is very fast paced. It's very move, move, move. And, you want to really follow these French models, and no, that's not what's happening, right? There's a new respect. Same thing with the Navajo folks. There's a sheep that was introduced, and this was like over 400 years ago. And it's not native. However, it's part of the native traditions now. Like, you cannot have right, ceremonies without this particular sheep, right? And so it's teaching us how to have new ceremonies. It's teaching us how to honor differently as well. So yeah, it's definitely enhancing culture. I wouldn't say so much changing culture, but it's enhancing, it's evolving. And that's what's beautiful, because I mean, if we don't evolve, then we stay stagnant, and then we die off. Then that's not what we want. We want our culture to thrive. We want it to keep going for the next generation, because as future ancestors and relatives, it is our responsibility to set up the next generations to come.
Yeah.
And food is what's helping us do that.
When I hear that question, I just think the thing that's most present for me is that I don't see a lot of new things happening per se. I see a lot of remembering. I
Yeah.
think that humankind is older than it knows. And I think that a lot of, what we're having, come up now is just us remembering how to be, and how to be in touch with the earth, and how to be in harmony. And that's what I mostly see, specifically for my community. It's just about remembering, like, okay, what was our diet, before we were brought over here? And even when we were over here, what was our grandma and great grandma doing? A lot of them had gardens. A lot of them ate a certain way. A lot of them picked foods that were similar to what our diets were on the continent, etc. So for me, it's really just about remembering.
Yeah, that's amazing. We have two questions. I'm going to ask the shorter one, and I guess if we have time, we can do the more deeper one. But the shorter one is, what are you guys going to eat for dinner tonight?
I haven't done any food prep yet. That's a good question. I was actually thinking about making some grains. I was thinking about maybe doing something with quinoa, and perhaps even amaranth. I've been really thinking about atole lately,
Mm.
and I have about 10 pounds of popped amaranth. So I was thinking of doing some recipe testing and playing. And but that's usually the base. I always start with a grain, and then from there I evolve and kind of figure it out. Um, but I'm definitely thinking greens as well. So it'll come together.
Where do
I'm
you,
gonna have lemon.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Olympia. No, go ahead.
I'm gonna have lemon juice. I'm about to start a 10-day juice cleanse on Sunday, so I'm getting myself ready for that.
Prepping.
Nice.
Claudia, where do you get 10 pounds of popped amaranth from?
Yeah. So,
That's a lot.
so yeah, that's funny. Yeah. So, there are different vendors that are available and accessible. Sometimes we get it shipped from different parts of the US. And so I was fortunate enough to come across a vendor that offered me the opportunity to get more amaranth that I usually get. But on the everyday, I usually go to the indigenous markets around here. And I know, folks are like, oh, what do you mean indigenous markets? They're Mexican markets. No, for me, Mexican is a culture. It's not who we are, right? It's something that was that comes out of our ethnicity. It's a practice of our ethnicity. And so I like to go to El Mercadito and East LA, where there's a lot of vendors that bring a lot of the food that they have worked with. So like from Oaxaca, there's the indigenous women, the vendors. They usually sell it by the pound, and I usually buy a few pounds because it does take work. I do it myself when I'm only going to do maybe a cup of popped amaranth. But I had an idea for this big pop-up. So when I go that route and I can have somebody already pop my amaranth for me in that amount of quantity, and yeah, I'm going to take it, especially when it's a really good deal.
Nice. That's awesome.
Thank
Well, we're
you.
down to like the last 30 seconds. So I want to thank you both for being here and for talking to us. This has been so fascinating, and you guys have really just sort of upped our game in terms of food and what the land looked and is still looking like.
Perfect. You know what? I've been kind of twisting my head over because I wanted to really pull a book here that spoke to what Olympia was sharing, and thinking about not just what are the foods that, for Black African communities that are rethinking this in terms of like, well, what are the foods that we regionally ate or perhaps, ate within our ancestry, or, our memories that speak to the continent of Africa, right? But then there's also those memories that were recreated in whether through Mexico, whether through the United States, even Canada. But I wanted to also give you another resource that has come out. It has created so much healing, I want to say. And it's called The Cooking Gene. And this is by Michael Twitty, and he basically wrote a book, but it's all based on recipes, A Journey Through African American Culinary History in the Old South. So he really provides a genealogy of food in rethinking, right, culture and decolonization.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that. I think there might be other questions that come up, so I will start passing them to you if there's one or two other questions that pop up, because they're coming in now and we are out of time. But to all those attended, thank you so much. I hope you got as much out of this as I did. And thank you again, both Claudia and Olympia, for being here and just talking to us and being so open.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone. And Claudia, I'm gonna hit you up on the email because
oh girl, yeah, I was already thinking that too. I'm gonna follow up.
That's a beautiful day. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of enjoy the solstice because it's upon us. So
yeah,
thank you guys.
Thank you, and we'll talk to you guys soon, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.